been going on, but also because as a structure, it was not fit for purpose. And one of the benefits, if we could call it that, of what has happened as far as Thameslink and GN is concerned, is that the southern timetable in totality is working better. But we need to get the Thameslink and Great Northern timetable right to then ensure the benefits for the metro parts of the southern timetable.
Okay, and can you actually give us the number of services that have been cut from the timetable, perhaps in absolute terms, to give us a real picture here, as well as perhaps a percentage?
Varies day by day. It's typically about 350, some of which are planned and some are on the day cancellations, which obviously in a live railway we suffer, and I apologise for some cancellations this morning arising from some problems we had on the coast, but also a very nasty fatality on Friday night in Purley, which has caused some engineering problems for our fleet engineers. But that number of cancellations varies, and the objective that we have at the moment is to give the best possible passenger information to ensure that our passengers can plan their journeys as far as they can, but it changes to some extent on a daily basis.
Around 350 a day out of how many services?
Well, across all of GTR, it's about 3,400, rising to 3,500, I think, in the new timetable.
About 10% of trains
Yes.
are just being cancelled, and that doesn't include others that are delayed and there are problems. So that's a pretty poor service for passengers.
We acknowledge that.
Okay. How are you really managing these current problems? What are you doing to get the timetable back on course? Because to be fair, the consultation you did was very thorough. We were involved in briefings, the public were able to input. To go from that to then what appears to be a disaster, surprised us all, because it felt, certainly at that point, that there was a lot of planning going on.
I think that's absolutely correct, and that goes to the heart, I think, of the industry-wide issues that we face in the implementation of the timetable thus far. The consultation was extensive, and some of the points that you made, Chair, in regard to some stations, there are always winners and losers in a timetable revamp, and this has been the biggest that the industry has undertaken in a generation. So the challenge was to deliver as much of the benefit as possible in that first phase as practicable, but there was an acknowledgement through the Industry Readiness Board and the Assurance Panel and with colleagues from the Department for Transport who sit on those bodies that the timetable needed to be phased in. The objective being that we had the opportunity to learn at each stage whether there were any gaps or plugs that we needed to fill to give the best possible service as we could to as many passengers as possible, accepting that there's always a trade-off in railway timetables between frequent stops and fast services over longer distances.
Okay, so how are you now managing the current problems to get back to the May stage of the new timetable?
So when we got to May the 20th, we had some very late presenting problems which have caused the difficulties. The work we're undertaking at the moment is to try to stabilise the timetable and to give as much passenger information as possible, and from today we've geared that up further in terms of what we have sought to do. For the first 2 weeks, it was a daily change to the timetable, and we recognise and apologise for that because it was awful for passengers. But from the second week onwards, we were able to pre-plan to a degree so that there was a weekly pattern as far as we could achieve it to the services that were taken out, but also the services that we were able to put back in. And we have been able to put back in some services. As we stand now, we are developing a timetable and working with colleagues from Network Rail to implement that from around about the middle of July. That will see a focus on peak services where obviously a lot of passengers travel, with some reductions in the off-peak, but not on the scale that we have currently, to achieve two things. Firstly, to give passengers a service on which they can rely much more than currently and have some predictability. But secondly, also to continue the driver training programme that was underway before the May the 20th changes. A lot's been made of driver training, but driver training was never intended to be completed by May the 20th. It was always going to continue through.
I'm going to focus on that in a minute, but when do you think the May timetable or a variation of it will be fully in place for passengers? Is it the mid-July date, or is it
No,
later?
it won't be the mid-July date. It's still in planning, and it's something we'll have to discuss with colleagues from the Department for
So
Transport.
that's not firmed up yet. Okay, thank you very much. I've seen Steve O'Connell.
Yes, thank you. Good morning to both of you. You'll be aware I represent Croydon and Sutton, and those areas are particularly directly affected by the changes. You mentioned earlier about the number of trains in a percentage manner not working. I think you have publicity saying around 20%. But if you look at the Peterborough to Halsall service, which particularly affects East Croydon and Coulston South and others, on some days 60% of the service is not running. That's pretty poor, isn't it? Would you like to comment on that, Nick?
So two or three things in regard to that. Peterborough to Horsham, as Cambridge to Brighton, are two of the longer distance services, and they are resourced from Peterborough and Horsham, not unsurprisingly, and we have not been in a position to conclude all the training for drivers in those two locations. It was never a case of all drivers at both locations. It was to respond to the demand that the first phase of the timetable put in place. But the allocation of work across the whole timetable has caused us that challenge, which means that we are slightly behind where we want to be. But that training now, we are with the cancellations, is enabling us to recoup some of that training time.
We're going to have questions around drivers later, but your point around that is a driver issue. Thank you for that. We talked upon the separation of Thameslink and Southern. I'm echoing here, which is kind of fine. You say in the main Southern services are running well. Well, in my area, we often have as many cancellations as Thameslink. For example, last Wednesday in the evening, areas such as Wallington, Thornton Heath and Norbury suffered 4 out of 5 consecutive cancellations to London. So that is equally poor, is it not? Well, could you explain why? Your earlier comment was, except Thameslink timetable is an issue, but Southern separation has been better. That doesn't reflect the details and the information I have.
So the services that you receive will be from Thameslink or Southern, depending on which part of south of the Thames you are from. And the figures I quoted before were across the whole of the geography. Inevitably, at some stations, there will be figures such as you've described. I haven't got all the detail precisely for every station, but what we are seeking to do to minimise the inconvenience to passengers where that occurs, and in particular 4 out of 5, which is wholly unacceptable, is to make alternative arrangements through other local transport, and that's across the network, buses and taxis as appropriate, but also to ensure that following trains have special stop orders so that passengers will still be able to get from station to station.
You say that sometimes there are other arrangements, but frequently you've cancelled particularly last trains and late trains without providing any alternative services. So people are stranded. Would you accept that?
I accept that it's a risk. Our policy is not to cancel the last train of the day. If there are any specifics that we've missed out on that you need me to follow up on, I will gladly do so. But our intent is to run the last train or last 2 trains of the day in every circumstance, and also to avoid consecutive cancellations where we can. Okay,
there's 2 things I'd like to comment on briefly. Is one about, even without the chaos, the new timetable has reduced services on what I call the inner London metro, areas like Norbury, Thornton Heath and Norwood Junction. There is a reduction in services there, and they have caused particular problems in South London, particularly around school times and Millwall and Crystal Palace football fans moving around. So they will be facing a reduction in timetable services. Do you acknowledge that there's a reduction in those services?
I mentioned before, there's always winners and losers with every timetable, but if there's a specific around those as a consequence of the plan to have the new timetable in place, I will happily take those away.
I'll write to you on that. And the last thing I will also write to you about is, and I did mention it to you earlier, is about easements. By the changing in the timetable, there's been certain off-peak trains being moved to just before 9:30, so therefore being moved to on-peak. And that has affected people. They've had to wait over half hour for the next off-peak. Now, TfL and others will be happy, have told me they're happy around easements, and you know aware what easements are. I'm told that GTR have turned their face against easements. If I write to you, will you look at that with some optimism, perhaps?
I don't think we've turned our face against anything. We accept that there are always going to be consequences of timetable change. We collect the revenue, but we don't keep the revenue from these. So it's a discussion from us, with us, and the Department for Transport. And if you write to me, I'll be very happy to take that
for some
up.
support.
Yeah.
Caroline, thank you.
Pick up some of those general issues in our
probably
correspondence following this. Can I
Indeed.
just welcome Cyborn Primary School from the London Borough of Waltham Forest. You're very welcome today. This is the Transport Committee, and we've got a train operator before us and Network Rail, and we're asking them questions about the new timetable they've brought in and the issues it's creating for passengers in London. Okay, the next section we're going to look at is getting into that new timetable, and Keith, you're going to lead
Thank
this.
you. Thank you very much. Clearly, part of the problem we've been told is the late agreement on the timetable, the fact that the agreement between yourselves and Network Rail was a bit late. So can I first of all ask John, if you don't mind, why was there this delay in the timetable being agreed?
So first of all, can I repeat the message that Nick has already given in terms of apology? The situation that we find ourselves in is completely unacceptable, and the criticisms that we face by passengers and the media is entirely appropriate, and no excuses for that. All we can do is to apologise and give you the commitment that we're doing everything we possibly can to fix it, which is what we are. So if I it's very difficult to answer that question very simply, so if you bear with me for a few seconds and I'll try and give you a sort of as honest account as I can. Without going back for years in history, which we could easily do, if we go back to about November of last year, there was a decision that had been in discussion for some time, which was to move from a proposal to roll the Thameslink timetable out in 2 phases, and a decision was made in the autumn of last year to move from 2 phases, which was considered to be a sort of a big bang, into a more drawn-out incremental change, a 4-phase timetable. It would be true to say that that decision was made later than we would have hoped, but at the time we felt that it was the lesser of 2 evils, because whilst it eroded a lot of time in terms of producing the timetable, we still felt we could deliver the new timetable collectively between Network Rail and GTR, and we still felt it was better than having this big bang approach. So the problem began, if you like, at that moment in time. Why did we think it was easier to roll out a 4-phase timetable as a 2-phase timetable? Because we felt that it was a removal of train services and therefore it would be relatively simple, and the experts in both GTR and within Network Rail felt that to be the case, and it was deliverable. If I go back in terms of reflection and ask myself, you know, what was the mistake that I made personally, it was allowing us to continue on at that moment, because once we started carrying on beyond that point, we had unconsciously created a position where it would be almost impossible to reverse. So at that point in time, we did actually have, broadly speaking, a timetable for the Big Bang approach, which was in accordance with the timescales of industry process. What we then had to do was to, in fairly short time, we had to produce, or GTR colleagues in GTR had to produce, a modified timetable. We expected that to be simple, relatively simple. Timetables are all pretty complicated, relatively simple, and we expected it to be complete very early in this year. In reality, it was much more complicated. There were a variety of reasons why it was more complicated. There was changes made for understandable reasons by GTR, there was changes made by Network Rail, there was changes made by the department, but what was intended to be a very simple change proved to be really quite complicated. And to put that into context, we were expecting collectively about maybe 800 or 900 changes to the timetable. It transpired that there was about 4,500, in fact marginally more than that, so considerably different. So we're now in a situation where the approval of so the timetable was effectively submitted late, but the approval of that timetable by Network Rail got later and later because of the additional complexity that we weren't expecting. So we were now eroding into important time that GTR needed. However, when we spoke to our respective timetable teams, they both felt comfortable they could get the timetable done, which they duly did, but it took longer and longer, even to the point where we were down to maybe just a few trains out of thousands and thousands of trains. But unpicking those last few trains actually meant us going back into the sort of heart and soul of the timetable and rebuilding it. So it was just a vastly complicated process. When we finally got the timetable approved, therefore, it was way later than we were expecting, and it's that, and therefore, from colleagues in GTR had a significantly reduced period of time to do the work that they have to do. Typically, I think, Nick obviously knows better than I do, but maybe 3 weeks instead of 12 weeks. If you add on that the layers of complexity, so this was already one of the biggest timetable changes in a generation. So not only did we have less time to process the timetable, but it was a much more significant timetable. So it's not strictly correct to say that, well, it is correct to say that Network Rail responded late, but really you've got to go back to the beginning of the sausage machine in terms of time to really understand why that's the case. I hope that it's quite a complicated story.
That's a very clear and helpful explanation. The question, therefore, is, with all these combination of delays and so on and so forth, and there only being 2 or 3 weeks until it had to go live, for want of a better phrase, why was it not suggested that the launch of the new timetable be delayed to enable GTR to get their ducks in a row?
So I'll take up the beginning of the tale, and then obviously the issue that
we're asking the same question of GTR.
Yeah, it almost by definition there's a handover point which I'll hand over to Nick. But to some extent I have answered some of the question. But question why? Well, let's rewind. Let's consider the governance process, because I think that's quite key in this process. So at least at the time, up until May the 20th, it felt like we had a robust governance process, which was beyond GTR and Network Rail. It was an industry readiness board chaired by elder statesmen of the industry. Sitting on that industry readiness board was the Office of Rail and Road, the department, 2 other colleagues from Network Rail, the Network Rail team that were responsible for the timetable, 5 operators, and a number of other individuals. So a very robust and capable team. In addition to that, and what that team did was they were reviewing the different component parts of operational readiness once a period. But in addition to that, there was another industry expert who actually then did deep dives into component parts and then reported back and identified risks. So quite a what we considered at the time to be a robust process to test and make sure that we were ready to roll this timetable out. So in hindsight, clearly that team was not as robust as we had hoped. So there was a series of questions and events. So the first question was in November, is it the right decision? Is it the right decision to move away from the 2-phase to the 4-phase? And at the time, all of the experts believed that whilst that did introduce some risk, that those risks could be mitigated, and that's a matter of fact and evidence in terms of the minutes of those meetings. So that was a moment in time. Next question was, well, okay, as we were going through those timetable changes and it became apparent that that assumption was incorrect, what was then happening with the Industry Readiness Board? And the view was, yes, we could still deliver the timetable in a timely way. Yes, there was risks, but both Network Rail, from a system operator, that overall position, felt that it was deliverable, and so did colleagues in GTR. The meetings were pointed and challenging. They weren't a walk in the park. We were collectively challenging each other, as you would expect. But the considered opinion of that group was that we could still progress. Clearly, time was being eroded, so there came a point in terms of driver rostering and training and all of that side of things, which I'll hand over to Nick to pick up.
Okay, thanks, John. I agree with that summary. I think I would just like to add a couple of things by way of dates, because as John has described, we submitted our proposed timetable in August of last year, based on the specification issued by the Department for Transport, which was what was called an end state specification. And that was submitted to Network Rail. And the end state would have been at the conclusion of the timetable phase in its totality, in the two-phase approach that John described. The offer back from Network Rail in November responded to that, and that in and of itself created a workload for GTR then to respond to. The two other things that were happening simultaneously was the phasing, which John has described, but also a specific change around Bedford with the removal of East Midlands train services, which was another major change, which as obviously the north end of the Thameslink service had to be incorporated into the plan. So colleagues in Network Rail Central Capacity Planning team were under some massive workload as a consequence of those changes, as well as wider ones across the rest of the country at the time, which caused, exactly as John says, some of the challenges that took a much more protracted period of time to resolve those timetable issues, which took us right through to sort of week 2, week 3 of April, when the timetable was finally proven, as Network Rail would describe it, and we then had something to work with to prepare our train diagrams, work schedules as we call them, diagrams as we call them, for the rolling stock and then for the drivers. And then from there you go to the last phase, which is what's called rostering, which is where those work schedules are applied to a roster for drivers to work around. The diagram stage, because of the haste with which it was done, we have usually no less than 12 weeks to prepare that part. Often 20 weeks is part of the industry process. So the industry process was creaking quite substantially in terms of what we were required to do. So our haste meant, necessary haste, meant that we had insufficient time to optimise the work schedules as we described them, and therefore had an inefficient set, which led to an inefficient roster. So the first part caused an increase in demand above plan for the workload for train drivers, and the second had a mismatch of their locations and where they were to drive. The issue then was that 3 days to go between posting roster and the timetable, very little time to do, and exactly to do anything different. And exactly as John says, the consequences to the rest of the rail network would have been catastrophic if we'd held with the existing timetable. It would have been more unworkable over a greater geography.
When it got to 3 weeks, or minus 3 weeks, however you want to express it, when you got the final plan, did it not sort of occur to anybody, either from Network Rail or yourself, to say, well, hang on, the industry standard's 12 to 20 weeks. Mm-hmm. We might be able to do 10, 15 weeks, but 3 weeks is not practical. We need to delay this for 20 weeks.
I think at that point it would have still been unworkable given the rest of the impact on the rest of the industry. I think the other thing was that each party in the process, and John described who they are, were working on a series of workarounds to make sure that we actually delivered the timetable as best we could. And I think the ultimate problem that we faced was that we ran out of time to deliver the workarounds that were there to get the whole timetable delivered on the 20th.
Yeah. Surely, John, Network Rail could say to the whole industry, look guys, I'm not saying you mucked up, but it just helps my phraseology. Mm-hmm. Look guys, there's been a mess up. There's been a delay in agreeing all the different timetables. Can everybody just stand where they are? Can everybody just keep doing what they're doing for another 2 months or a month or whatever period of time you need to buy time to get everything sorted? Why was that call not made?
So I think there's two aspects. I'll start with the end of the story while I remember it, which is with 3 weeks to go.
Will it change in a few minutes' time then?
This is being recorded, this conversation, a lot, so I think I'll be consistent. But So with 3 weeks to go, I'm not sure, and Nick will provide more detail in a few seconds. With 3 weeks to go, we weren't waving a red flag. With 3 weeks to go, we weren't in that position. So the red flag was waved considerably closer to 0 hours than that. But I think there's an important point that I would share with the committee, which I think is probably the essence of the problem that we face, or the cause of the problem underneath everything, which is that two years ago, in fact, Nick and I started in Roll about the same time. 2 years ago, when the Industry Readiness Board was set up, the Thameslink programme and the rollout of the timetable was an extraordinary challenge. It was an extraordinary challenge in terms of timetable, but the thing that we haven't spoken about is the infrastructure changes. So, London Bridge, Blackfriars, Farringdon, stations, new stations, refurbished stations, new infrastructure that nobody ever sees, new points, tracks, retraining of staff, new signalling, new technology, some of the first in the country, and a long list. 7 billion.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
I do apologise, but because we are short on time. The question is, though, it's one thing if you're playing with a train set in your loft, but you're playing with a real train set, which I'm very envious actually. But you're playing a real train set, real people. You've got to deal with rolling stock. You've got to deal with driver training. You've then also got to deal with the unions as well. Who in their right mind, if I'm afraid that, would think that you could achieve any of that in 3 weeks? Because my experience is you're lucky to do it in 3 months. So why would you then say, yeah, well, I think we can do this by the seat of our pants? It doesn't seem like a sensible decision to be made.
So that preamble was I think important, because with that level of complexity 2 years ago, we had to create an environment, and we collectively as an industry created an environment where we can do it. Because if we hadn't created a culture of can do, then quite frankly nothing would have happened. And 2 years ago that was the direction of travel. So 2 years ago there was a momentum, we can do this, and a passion to do it, because we knew that doing it, and it still will deliver huge benefits to passengers, and we will get there in the end. But 2 years ago we wanted to create that culture, and we created the culture. Now that culture was processing risks all of the time, as all of us are very aware of. As problems arose, those problems were dealt with. Day after day, problems arose, they were mitigated and dealt with. The mistake that we made was that as those problems continued to arise, even up to the last minute, our attention was focusing on resolving them and dealing with the risk associated with them, rather than putting the red flag up and saying, it's too late. And I unreservedly apologise for the fact that we failed to put our foot on the ball until it was too late. But I can only say it. I can only say it as it is.
I'm going to bring this bit to a close, but I just find it difficult to understand why. And you've already touched on it. You weren't just dealing with changing the timetables. You were dealing with virtually a new train line. You were dealing with new stations, new underpasses and tunnels, new rolling stock. I mean, there's so many new variables, any of one of which, if it went wrong, would cause a problem. And yet you still decided, with only 3 weeks to go, well, let's see what happens. And I find that very surprising. But I just want to, I'm conscious of time, so I just want to throw in one other googly, if you like, which is around complexity and the fact that in the south, it's a bit of a lottery actually as to where you're going to end up when you get on a train, in my experience. So you go to different stations. All the trains where I come from in Romford, all the trains go to Liverpool Street or they go to Shenfield, and it's quite simple. In the south, they tend to go to different mainline stations or different stations. And Peter Hendy actually commented on it. I'm sure you've heard of Peter Hendy, around how difficult it is going to all these multiple selections. For instance, there's a line that will go to, one train goes to Cannon Street, the other one goes to Charing Cross. Would there not be some argument in saying we're just going to go to one track instead of having trains crisscrossing all over, all over the place. Is it just too complex?
I'd pick that one up, Mr. Prince. I think you've almost described the whole dilemma of the project, and that is to link north and south of the capital, to cope with phenomenal growth. And frankly, where do you put the trains? Because there are some unlikely origin and destination points. We've talked about Peterborough and Horsham. The issue is not that Peterborough and Horsham of themselves need to be linked. It is that you can just run the trains end to end, so you don't have to leave them stationary in London, which would take up vast quantities of real estate to have even larger stations to do that. And we have London Bridge, which has been fantastically rebuilt by colleagues in Network Rail, but even that is getting close to capacity, and running the trains through London Bridge and then through the core out to St Pancras and then north from there is the most efficient way of moving the large numbers of people that we need to move into and across the capital. But if I may just come back to an earlier point you made about infrastructure, routes, trains, technology, all of those parts did come together. But we have not only just recently started to train people to drive the new trains or to learn the routes. That has been going for quite a while.
That's our next section, so let's
hold
your comments.
But it all fits together, and I think, as John says, yes, there were a series of workarounds that we had to put in place and mitigations. And, I reiterate our apology that when all of those, the time ran out on them, that's when, the problems started.
I'll just ask one final question. Whose decision would it have been to run with the ball, or who would have been the person to say, actually, we can't run with this, it's just too tight? Who made the decision to go with it? Or who didn't make the decision to not go with it? And whose decision is that?
I'm sure John will speak for himself as well, but I think those of us sitting at the Industry Readiness Board all had a participative play in that. But from the actual operation of GTR, that would have been myself or the Chief Executive Officer. But we were acutely aware of our role within the industry structure and the implications it would make. But I think in terms of how this has come to pass, not just here, but perhaps in the north of England as well, the issues that we face are industry structure, and the processes that we face, that we have to work through, perhaps were built for a time and designed for a time very different from the levels of investment that are going into the rail industry now. And therefore, we welcome the opportunity to sit down with the ORR in their review and the industry debate that's raging at the moment as to what the best way to do this going ahead is. Our first job, I hope I speak for John in this, is to get this put right for our passengers and for London as soon as we can, in a sensible and safer way as we can. The challenge for the wider industry is to develop processes that are fit for purpose and not to make a bad process better.
Okay, thank you. The Peter Hendy point before he became your chair is about it having 17 different ends, this route, rather, and Crossrail is complicated enough with 3. Tom, you wanted to come in quickly.
Just a couple of other points on that. So you said that with 3 weeks to go there wasn't a sort of red flag going up, but I'm wondering how on earth there wasn't. You know how many trains you need, you know how many drivers you need, you know how long it takes to train a driver, you know how many drivers have been trained and how many more you need. With 3 weeks to go, surely you'd know whether or not it was going to work.
So 3 weeks out, we received the timetable from Network Rail. We then have to assess the number of work schedules. The number of work schedules was greater than we had planned for, and in the plans that we'd shared with the Industry Readiness Board, by roundly 50-55 drivers. That used the contingency that we had in place to immediately use the contingency that we had in place to run the service. Because of the challenges, one of the or two of the issues that were always part of the plan for this was to continue the training throughout the whole process and through the subsequent phases that we described before, and secondly to achieve that by what we call piloting drivers through the core part from East Croydon through to St Pancras or Blackfriars typically, to enable drivers who didn't have that key part of route knowledge, because London Bridge obviously was being rebuilt and such like. That was the key part to get folk through. We then had to go further afield, and we did very quickly bring in training managers, testing and commissioning drivers who'd been bringing in the new trains and such like, to reinforce behind the contingency that had been used up. But at that point of 3 weeks out, and it was a bit less by the time we'd issued diagrams, so we're down to 2.5 weeks, perhaps about 2 weeks, we had started to flag to the Industry Readiness Board that there was a problem and that there would have to be some contingency further to enable us to close that gap, because we'd soaked up the 50 drivers into the base service away from the piloting programme which had been there.
Joe's going to come on to ask some questions about drivers, but just finally on the complexity point, I mean, in our briefing it said that Network Rail had warned the Department for Transport that when the franchise was let, that the timetable was going to be too complicated. So, John, you kept using the word deliverable, saying yes, it was deliverable, but did Network Rail really believe that it was deliverable, given what we've heard, which is they were telling the Department for Transport it wasn't? And that when Peter Hendy, of course, became chair, based on what he'd said to us as well.
Yeah, so that's correct. Network Rail, I think in the original refranchising process, did say, I think that the proposal that had been submitted wasn't deliverable, but then we spent several years working with GTR to create what we considered to be a working proposal. I don't think it's fair to blame the current situation on that original rejection. I think everybody would accept that the level of change was hugely ambitious and still is, but I believe that we can come up with a plan that will work. It will always be challenging. It will be ambitious, but we need to do it, and I believe we can do it. So I think we do need to focus on the recent history in terms of what's gone wrong, rather than blame those decisions, because I think it's recent history where we've tripped up badly.
Thank you.
Let's move on to drivers. Joanne.
Yes, as one of your long-suffering passengers on the Great Northern route, even before the new timetable, unavailability of driver was quite a frequent excuse given as to why my train wasn't arriving. But we've touched on it already, but can I just ask you for some detailed figures? Can I ask you, Nick, how many drivers had you planned that you actually needed?
So at the time of the timetable change, and I will explain the headline and then the detail, we needed 889 drivers.
889.
And we had resourced 898. That included bringing some in at short notice from Southern and South Eastern, who we recruited when we were aware of the diagram problem. So that's what took up the contingency that I just described.
And is that total number of drivers or additional drivers?
No, that's total number of drivers across Thameslink and GN, because the number of diagrams that we'd forecast was 854, and that went to 930. And these things always do jump around a bit, but by not as much as you would expect as that. So that was the quantum problem that we faced 3 weeks out. We believe we'd solved that one.
Training problem.
But then we went to an issue where we had the rostering problem.
Okay.
So drivers were training well before the timetable change. We'd trained on one example, over 52% through what we call High Level 17, which is the new part through London Bridge. So when London Bridge reopened after the work that Network Rail undertook at Christmas and the New Year, within a week we were back training people through London Bridge, by diverting some passenger services where we could off the Herne Hill route and such like.
Stick with training for the moment. You've obviously given me an example there, but we've heard, for example, on the Peterborough to Horsham line, only 15% of the drivers had been trained at the time the new timetable came into effect. Is that correct?
Quote a percentage, but I know that there were a dozen drivers trained at Peterborough for 2 what we call lines of work. So that would not have been a bad ratio, from 12 to 2 lines of work.
It would be useful if you could write afterwards.
If I could write to you and
with
explain
the various
that, yeah.
lines and
Yeah.
drivers, that would be
So
helpful.
for basically for 2 jobs, we had 12 people, which over a week would have worked, and those were plans that we'd explained to the Industry Readiness Board and where we'd put up the red flag when we did at the beginning of May.
And you started rostering drivers, and what happened then?
Yeah. So the rostering process is one that we go through. There's two phases with colleagues from the trade unions. One is to agree the diagrams, which is a consultative process, and then a negotiable process, which is the rostering. So we had a greater quantum of diagrams and a high degree of inefficiency in those, which is what drove the increased numbers that I've described. So you had increased numbers, and then as they were then applied to the roster, further inefficiency and a mismatch of the route knowledge, which we've just talked about, say, for Peterborough Horsham, where that work fell across the different depots that we have. I'm sorry it's so complicated.
And I believe, is this part of some new software you were using, or was it?
No,
Okay.
no. We are investing in new software which will enhance the process. But it doesn't take away from the responsibilities we have to trade unions, in those joint processes. What we did was have insufficient time, as John has described, to do that in a quality way. And I pay tribute to those colleagues from the trade unions who worked late into the night to get that done, because it was on the 17th, 18th of May when we were able to conclude that and post the rosters. That's when we realised, and nobody else had put their finger on it from any part of the industry until that point, that we had that problem then.
Okay, and can I also ask about going back to training? Do you have, or did you have, sufficient training instructors to do the training that was needed? Or are you looking at that again?
We've recruited over 19% more train drivers over the last few years into Thameslink GN and GTR in total. Our driver training programme is one of the largest in the land because when the franchise was let, there was insufficient train drivers and a backlog had to be recouped. Along with an advancing age profile, there was a clear need to recruit more train drivers. So the training management teams, the courses that we run are very substantial and have always been well populated, and we will continue to recruit train drivers. The problem that we had when the rostering problem hit, following the diagrams problem, the work schedules problem, was that we had to use our competency development managers and our training managers, all fully qualified as train drivers, to support the piloting through the core part, because those that we had intended to use on the core part of the network for training were used supporting the main train service. So our key objective at the moment is to have those people return to training to continue to pass out some of the new drivers and some of the existing drivers on new routes.
Okay, so going forward, when do you believe you'll have enough drivers for the planned routes and the planned new timetable?
It's difficult to pin down exactly when, simply because it is a part here and a part there, and the distribution as a consequence of the rosters has made that difficult to predict. What we do have, and what we have been doing in the last few weeks, is rather than a depot-based, train drivers depot-based plan, and we have gone to an individual train driver training plan, which in fairness we had before, but we've gone to a greater degree of granularity to pinpoint exactly where a train driver can pass out in terms of getting the qualification needed to complete their work, to gain route knowledge. So that will work out over the next 4 to 5 months. But as time goes on, the quantum, back to the Peterborough illustration, is that there will be a greater number of competent drivers for a fixed number of work schedules that they work to. I can write to you if that makes more sense. I accept there's a lot to take in.
Because obviously the new timetable will come in at some
Yeah.
point, and
Yes.
it would be helpful if there weren't cancellations at that point.
Well, that is the whole objective, but we've got to
Exactly.
trade off, putting some cancellations in the service from July compared to what it would have been in the May 20th timetable, but also allowing us to recoup the training period that we've lost since May the 20th and getting back to the training gradient and pass-out rate that we had in place before.
We were told that last October drivers started expressing concern that the training was too late and that the predicted training rate meant that you wouldn't have enough drivers. Are you aware of that?
The challenge with train drivers learning new routes is that their knowledge lapses after 6 months. So for a timetable starting in May, January or the previous December is probably the window of opportunity to start that train driving. We were satisfied that we had a trajectory that gave us enough train drivers. We had a plan which we'd shared with the Industry Readiness Board to give them competence over what was required. The Readiness Board had acknowledged and supported the fact that we were going to have to continue training throughout, and all parties in the Industry Readiness Board were aware of that, and we were preparing mitigations. I speak many times a week to train drivers in various guises, and usually when they're driving trains or on the platform. Some did express a concern, but when I explained the background as to how we were doing this, actually they understood the how and why. And interesting, some Peterborough drivers actually said, hang on, Nick, there's only 12 drivers here. Ah, yes, but it's not for 30 lines of work, it's for 2 or 3 lines of work to start with. And that's how it was working through. But where you're dealing with those ratios, what we presented on May the 4th was the second iteration to the Industry Readiness Board of how we were going to try and manage in that very, very time-constrained period.
And just quickly before we move on, you have a very unusual franchise in that DFT, rules every single thing you do. Did you ask the DFT for funding for driver training, which they declined?
The franchise arrangements for GTR are, as you say, complicated. Those are a matter of negotiation with the department, along with other aspects of the Thameslink programme introduction.
So did you request further funding for driver training that the DFT declined?
I'm not aware that they've declined anything yet. We haven't asked for any extra funding.
You're
over
not
and
aware
above.
that in the last 6 months you asked for further funding for driver
No,
training?
there is a discussion as part of our ongoing business with the department that is to fund the totality of some of the Thameslink work, of which driver training is part and parcel. But that is all there in discussions weekly and monthly, and has been for a long time. It's not as a consequence of any of the problems that we've encountered.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to that in correspondence. Let's move on to looking at the infrastructure and rolling stock. Tom.
Thank you. John, why wasn't the network ready for the timetable changes?
So all of the infrastructure was available, and none of the problems that we're facing today are infrastructure related. Some of the challenges in the north of the country have sort of filtered their way through in terms of the challenges that parts of the Network Rail face in terms of timetable processing. But there's none of the problems that we're facing today are infrastructure related.
There were a number of issues though. So for example, the train management system was delayed.
So the train management system is still behind programme, but it doesn't have any impact in terms of the current situation at all. Train management typically takes, it's the first time, it's quite exciting as much as the technology is brand new to the overground railway, but recognised knowledge on the subject means that it takes typically about between 18 months and 3 years to deliver the benefits. So that you're absolutely right. The bigger priority in terms of traffic management is about making sure that when it goes in, it's right, because it's a slow burn benefit.
So you're saying that's not had any impact at the moment?
No, there are no infrastructure issues which impact on the current situation.
I find that rather difficult to believe, really. Our briefing is saying that because of the delays with this, because it wasn't in place, controllers were overwhelmed when the new timetable came in.
That's incorrect.
That's not correct.
It is completely incorrect. So I think we've provided a very clear narrative as to the challenges that we face in terms of consuming time, squeezing up the process to the end so that colleagues in GTR struggle to make sure that drivers are available. So the challenges that we face, that we are prioritising and trying to fix today, is all about is dealing with the cancellations. Those cancellations are due to driver availability. It's as simple as that. Now, if in the event that traffic management was available, then it's questionable, even if it was available, whether or not it would deliver material benefits, because it does take a long time to deliver. So there's definitely nothing to do with that.
One other aspect of the infrastructure, which I believe has had a knock-on impact on driver training, is that the canal tunnels weren't made available, or they weren't made available in a timely way. Why was that?
The canal tunnels were available for empty coach moves from October 2016. Okay, so I don't know whether your records say that. When they weren't available for passenger services until February, they were always programmed to be available in March. What became apparent at one of our industry readiness board meetings and also another meeting that Nick and I hold together is that to train drivers, the sooner that the canal tunnels were made available, the better. But in terms of programmed delivery, they were programmed to deliver in 2016, and they were available for empty rolling stock, and actually they were delivered ahead as a result of Nick pushing for them to be delivered ahead. They were delivered ahead of the March date this year.
It says they were delivered in mid-February and only after pressure from Govia.
Yeah, that's correct.
But I mean, and that's only when and it was mid-February when they became available for route training.
So
I can see Nick wants to come in on.
Yeah,
on
I think
this point.
the little piece of the jigsaw, if I may, Mr. Copley, is that whilst they were available for empty stock moves, you've still got to run a train through and put it somewhere. And therefore, when and John and I were both very active in the meeting to get it opened in February the 26th this year, was so that we could start to run passenger trains through, because that was the most efficient way of having competent drivers training other drivers to get through.
the question that we posed at the time, because obviously this is a well-trodden conversation, the question was so the original plan, which is I guess the point that I'm making, is the original plan was available for empty rolling stock in 2016. I don't know whether it was October, but it was some time ago. The original plan was have them available for passenger moves in March. That was the plan. That's what Thameslink had to do. That's what Thameslink did. The question is...
But empty rolling stock, does that mean a driver can...
Does that mean a driver can go through? Can't have passengers on
yes,
the
yes, but does that mean a driver who's being trained can go through?
Could be. But if I could, so the question which was not asked was, Thameslink had a programme, they followed the programme, Network Rail delivered according to that programme, but the Thameslink programme team did not ask GTR, when do you need this to be available? Similarly, GTR didn't say to Network Rail, when will it be available? So I'm not making a judgment as to who's right or wrong. I'm simply saying that in terms of the original programme, the infrastructure was made available on time.
Does that mean you weren't talking to each other?
Well, this is. I mean, it sort of plays back to the point that Mr. Prince made earlier on, which is there are thousands and thousands of interdependencies. We were talking to each other, which is why it was raised at one of our readiness meetings, and it was flagged as a risk. But there was an assumption that the Thameslink programme timetable was well understood. That assumption was incorrect.
Well, John's referring to Thameslink there. He means the Thameslink programme as opposed to GTR. Yeah. So, yeah, that's all right. The issue for us was that if we had access as we would have ultimately wished, to Canal Tunnels, we would have been parking trains in St Pancras when passenger trains were there, and the operational risk to the service as it was at the time at the back end of last year would have been way too great.
So you wouldn't have used them for train?
Other than at the margin to train
Right.
testing and commissioning drivers who work under special rules, the only efficient way for us to have done that, to have trained drivers, which is what we did, was to get early permission as soon as we could in January. And it was at the January IRB where I led the charge and John supported us in saying to the programme, we need this sorting very quickly, please. And it was by the 26th of February.
And just more broadly in terms of infrastructure, when John says that the infrastructure didn't have any impact on this, do you agree?
The work that was scheduled to be complete has been complete. There are still some issues that affect us south of the river, but they were not material to the introduction of the timetable.
John, are there any other infrastructure improvements still outstanding, and if so, when will they be finished?
Nick said there are a few minor infrastructure issues, but I think I'm answering this with respect to which are impacting on train performance today. I presume that's the context of the question. So there are a few minor ones in terms of turnbacks and some signalling, but nothing that is materially impacting on the problem that we're facing today. So no.
And finally, John, why was Nick, why was the rolling stock so late to enter service?
The rolling stock, the Class 700 trains were delayed in, and this predates my time in GTR, were delayed in delivery from Germany. It required the drivers in some parts to relearn, and it caused some dislocation a couple of years ago to their training programme. The trains were not as reliable as they should have been. Their miles between failures was much lower than we expected. Siemens have worked hard to improve that and have rolled out a series of software modifications to do that. But for May the 20th, we had all the trains that we needed across the network on the Class 700 fleet, both full-length unit and reduced-length units.
I believe there were some issues with the financing, but that was something that was for the Department for
I can't comment on that.
So, yeah. Okay.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. We're on our last section now, and I did speak to our guests. They're happy to stay to complete this. So it's on passengers. Florence, you're going to start.
Thank you, and I appreciate that the two of you started off by offering apologies for the recent chaos, but the reality is for passengers who are using these routes, apology is not what they want. They just want a functioning train service for which they're paying thousands of pounds annually. A recent survey by Which found that 3 out of 5 respondents replied by saying that this change of a new timetable has had a major impact on their health, their finances and their family life. A number of people are just really, really struggling. We're seeing scenes at stations where people are being crammed on platforms. People are then taking that frustration out on hard-working staff. It's just not fair. In terms of what's going on, what is your message to passengers who are affected, not just across London and South East, but right across the country?
Let me start by reiterating our apology, and I know that your point is well made, that passengers want us to get back to as normal a service as we can as soon as possible, and we want that as well. I have met with many of those passengers. We have met at Meet the Manager sessions, which we hold frequently at King's Cross and more recently at London Bridge, and travelling on trains. So we do know and we do feel, and we obviously see through our post bag the discomfort, the challenges, the life impact that this is having on people. Make no bones about it, we do understand that. And John's colleagues stand shoulder to shoulder with us when we've met our passengers at those set-piece events. The compensation that's in place, GTR has an industry-leading delay repay compensation scheme in place. I say it's industry-leading because it's after 15 minutes, so that's compensation to be paid to passengers at 15 minutes. Since the 20th of May, we've had 260,000 applications for compensation, and 80% of those have been processed within 2 days. And that is against the timetable as it should be, not against the interim arrangements that we have. We are about to launch a poster campaign to raise the visibility of that, as well as the online systems, so that passengers can claim what they are entitled to.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And my understanding is that you do have a lot of data for your passengers, because again, a number of them purchase their tickets well in advance. You've got their details. So in terms of the passengers who still haven't come forward, what are you doing proactively to reach out to them? Because again, when you're trying to juggle with, one, getting to work on time, explaining to your boss why you're late, then trying to plan your route back to probably pick up the kids and get home, get them ready for bed. The last thing you want to do is actually go online and fill out a compensation form, but they're entitled to that. Is there anything that you think that you can offer in terms of passengers that haven't come forward?
So a good proportion have come forward, clearly indicated by the figures that we've got. We, as I say, are raising the profile of that, so that passengers who have not yet made contact with us, who are affected, not all are affected, but many are affected, so that we can make that compensation available to them in an efficient and swift way.
I understand that in 2016, the GTR offered season ticket holders compensation equivalent to 1 month's travelling following some of the delays. Again, will that, something to the tune of that nature, be offered?
Arrangements put in place as a consequence of the industrial action. The revenue that we collect on behalf of the Department of Transport, it is the Department for Transport's revenue that we're collecting. So any other arrangements beyond what I've just described will need to be agreed with the Department for Transport.
Just finally, before I hand over to my colleague, Caroline, what more do you feel that could be done in terms of the messaging and information getting out to passengers? Because again, I think that sheer frustration of turning up, standing at a platform, sometimes the staff at the station don't know what's going on. That, I think there's still a lapse in terms of the information coming down to the ground. So some of this could be headed off by, that making sure that you're getting that information out in a more timely manner. I appreciate that there'll be some cancellations which may be out of your control, but again, those decisions are being taken somewhere. So making sure, what more do you think can be done in making sure that information is going out?
One of the challenges that we've had is getting that information out as fast as electronic media, and there are different forms of electronic media to get to passengers and to staff, because passengers now are seeing stuff at the same time as staff are seeing it. So we've had some issues with 1 or 2 central London stations to make sure that that information is as fast as it can be. You are absolutely right about cancellations. The other challenge we've had is where we've reinstated trains, and that's making sure that there is sufficient notice so that passengers can plan their journey, be it 20 minutes in advance, be it 10 minutes in advance, and to know what the stopping pattern for that train is. But the key objective for us and for our colleagues in Network Rail and the rest of the rail industry is to get this timetable sorted by bringing in an interim arrangement in July, as I've described, catching up on the backlog of training and getting that trajectory right to get the full benefits of this massive investment programme in place.
Thank you.
Caroline.
Thank you. Nick, you started off earlier this morning saying there are always going to be winners and losers in a timetable revamp. And what it seems that we're looking at here is an awful lot of losers. People are, just in terms of planning, I mean, you say, there's never consecutive trains cancelled, and you try and
try to avoid them.
You're trying to avoid that, and you say that the last train doesn't get cancelled. But in terms of people planning ahead, that is really difficult. We, in our briefing, it says that so on the 19th of June, GTR was updating its online timetable on Friday for the following week. I mean, this is really difficult for passengers who are really relying on these services to get work and to get to work and to get home at the end of the day. When do you think that the full planned service will be operating?
Can I just pick up the first part about the 19th of June? What I said earlier was the winners and losers, firstly. And I accept that there's losers at the moment because the service is just poor. The issue around the plan that we put in place, in which the Chair described as a very comprehensive consultation that we did, there is always a trade-off between stopping a train frequently to pick up passengers versus running them fast. And therefore, stopping patterns have changed. They change at school times to pick up and drop off school children, appropriate to the time of the day and the geography that they serve. So that's what I meant by winners and losers in terms of how a timetable is constructed and not letting trains get in the way of each other. To the wider point of the 19th of June, once we got through the first 2 weeks, which I described as almost daily changes that we had to make to try and get some stability in, we were changing and strengthening the timetable week on week. So the 19th of June will have been one of those weekly changes. It should not have changed substantially other than to put in incremental trains where we were sure that we could run them. And the objective is to give that forecast for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks ahead. That was our intention. So the changes from that week to subsequent weeks would have been incremental and building up. The objective we're trying to avoid was what we had in the first 2 weeks, where passengers are faced when they get into a station of just seeing cancelled, 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 which is not the intention at all. We need to show passengers what is running and what is, assuredly running. That's the point.
So how much longer should passengers expect this situation to be going on for until they can expect a stable timetable?
So as I've mentioned, round about mid-July, we're looking to, and it's subject to agreement with colleagues in the Department for Transport and the franchise management team, to put in a timetable that will enable us to offer a greater level of surety to passengers. It will have fewer trains in the off-peak. We will aim to secure the peak, obviously, because that's when the bulk of people are travelling, but also to improve on the timetable that was in place beforehand. And then, as I mentioned before, build up through the rest of the year to the full level of the May timetable.
Sorry, the full level of the May timetable, you mean
Insofar as we can, between the July timetable change that we want to make to bring in some stability and then to build the rest of the promise of the May timetable. Now, sorry, if I can just qualify that. Because of the way the system works, adding extra trains in happens in an inefficient way because of the manpower requirements for driver resources or whatever. What we want to do is to make sure that what we build in to get back to the full timetable, firstly, is assured for passengers. That's the key thing. We don't want to put something in 1 week and then find that we've got a problem in the subsequent week. We will do it in steps, and we're not going to give any guarantees yet as to exactly when that's going to be. But the first step will be from the middle of July.
People find it quite hard to understand why these careful steps are happening now and hadn't happened months previously so that it was able to be delivered properly. I just want to move on to the December timetable change. Now, we've heard through this morning about the problems of processing risks and getting so involved in the detail of firefighting the problems as they were coming up that no one had kind of had a helicopter view to put up a red flag and say, hey, we've got a problem here. Now, what guarantees can you give that you are working differently so that the December timetable change can be implemented smoothly? That's a question for both of you.
Can I just pick that up first around the careful steps? You have absolute assurance that we will be taking very, very careful steps going ahead and shouting even louder than some of us did shout beforehand. But I accept your point. So the careful steps is in everybody's interest, but most of all has to be in the interest of our passengers. That's first and foremost.
And can you just say, if you were shouting beforehand, who were you shouting at and they weren't listening?
Well, we told you about
DFT?
At the Industry Readiness Board, we raised the issue of the fact that we had the problem of diagram shortage, which was causing diagrams that were causing the increase in the driver requirement. That was there. Perhaps we could have shouted louder, perhaps...
That was at 3 weeks.
That would be under that, 2 weeks out.
2 weeks out.
Nobody was listening.
That was at the May the 4th where we raised the issue, but the readiness board was aware of the issues that we were facing And there were some red flags and there were some yellow flags and all that sort of stuff, as you would normally expect from a programme and project management appraisal, if you will, assurance process. The issue that we were concerned about, and perhaps we could have shouted louder, perhaps it wasn't much a shout as a this is the concern, but the point is we want to make sure that those steps are all in place before we start to change the timetable as we head towards December. That's really what I want to say there.
So we have a new chief exec who's coming in from a Network Rail perspective, and the Secretary of State has asked Andrew Haynes, our new chief exec, to make a recommendation. My understanding is that with respect not just to the GTR December timetable, but all of the national timetables, because it's a significant change across the country again. And Andrew, as I understand it, has made a recommendation to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State is considering those recommendations with an expectation of an announcement later this week.
With an expectation of
an announcement later this week, in terms of what will be progressing and won't happen with respect to the December timetable.
Okay, and so presumably you're not able to speculate on that until that announcement happens.
Correct, yeah.
But do you, I'm not sure that you've actually answered whether you expect the December timetable change to be implemented smoothly.
No,
do you
right.
think?
No,
do you think what is happening now is going to enable this timetable to be implemented smoothly, or do you think you're going to be bogged down in the same old problems?
So I think we have learnt a lot of lessons, but I think that we have a lot to do between now and December if we were to roll out the December timetable. And I think both GTR and Network Rail are of the opinion that even if we could assure ourselves that we were ready, it would be a difficult message to convince passengers. And therefore, playing to what Nick said earlier, we need to be very conservative in our approach. So some of that thinking has gone into the recommendations that Andrew has made to the Secretary of State.
Do you have a plan B in case you find that you're not ready for December?
We do. Do you want to pick that up?
Can I just clarify this bit about shouting out? Because we've been through a lot in the Industry Readiness Board, and whilst risks are raised, they get addressed and mitigated. But that is the whole issue that we faced around the mitigations and the workarounds that we were putting in place. We weren't shouting and screaming at every meeting or anything like that. Some risks came and some risks went, but the risks that eventuated with us were ones at the last minute, which we raised. In regard to Plan B, it's effectively what we're having to do at the moment, which is not where we want to be. The plan for the mid-July timetable will be the one that takes us back on a trajectory that we're comfortable with through to getting the timetable back in place. The timetable is due to step up by 2 trains going through the centre of London in December. That's the subject to the review that John was talking about, led by Andrew Haynes.
So I'm not trying to be opaque here, it's just I'm trying to keep the answers straightforward. So a proposition which has been considered would be to take what we're doing now and make incremental improvements between now and December, but rather than put the extra trains in, we don't put those additional trains in. That will provide passengers with a service which is at least as good as it was before the timetable change, and then we can make some incremental improvements beyond that, so it will get better and better. Obviously, what we are very cautious about is making a more significant step in December, and it all falls down again. So until the Secretary of State has made the decision based on the recommendations, I can't say any more than that, but I've probably explained our thinking. Would it be possible for me just to respond to Mrs. Shalomi's
yes, of
question
course,
around
of course.
passengers?
Before I bring in other members, of course.
So I completely I heard the emotion in your voice. It's very difficult for us not to get emotional about it as well. Nick talked about the experience that we have when we meet passengers. We do meet passengers. We stand at London Bridge, and the passengers are understandably keen to share their personal circumstances, and we are there because we want to hear it and we want to understand it and we want to emotionally engage in it. We care. There's another aspect that I guess we all forget about, which is that I have 3,500 people in my team and Nick has an even larger number. And these guys get out and girls get out of bed just to run an effective railway. That's what they do for a living. That's all they care about. And the railway is a bit of a family. And those individuals, you know, this is devastating. So and it's devastating because we care, and the teams care, and they care with a real passion. And for people whose livelihood it is to support passengers, to see those passengers so upset, you know, I completely understand how passengers feel, but everybody is totally heartbroken by the current situation.
Just on that, is there additional support for staff? Because again, like I said, they're the ones on the receiving end of this frustration from passengers.
And to be honest, passengers are, despite everything, are incredibly helpful in terms of looking after staff. Some of them are perhaps a little bit more challenging, but often place passengers themselves put a bit of a red flag up. But I'm not saying that for a sympathy vote in terms of the Network Rail and GTR teams, but they care. We all care passionately to fix this as fast as we can. We really do. So.
Thank you for that. I've seen Joanne and Tom wanting to come in.
Yeah, my question is to GTR, and that's about customer service and particularly passenger information. I mean, on the 7th of June, I was stuck on a train in the platform at Moorgate, seemingly not going anywhere. And the announcer at one stage stated, I quoted it, I wrote it down, and says, "I can't give you information because no one's telling me anything." And she was desperately trying to tell us whether she had trains coming in or not, where they were going to, and she just couldn't. And I met someone on the train this morning coming in, and they told me that last week she got a train to go to Palmer's Green. It stopped at Bowes Park because there was a faulty headlight. She got out, she got on the next train, and it whizzed straight past the station, but no one had told her anything because it was trying to make up time. So as well as many cancellations and lateness, delays at the moment, passenger information does seem to be lacking. I'm just wondering if you're going to be addressing that.
Yeah, I mean, we're aware of that, and I refer to what I said earlier. I mean, I'm not aware of the Palmer's Green Bowes Park issue specifically, but trying to get information to staff on platforms, which is what you'll have had at Moorgate, is challenging, because if they're out talking to passengers, they're not in front of a computer screen. If they're in front of a computer screen, they're not in front of passengers. But we've created separate teams dedicated to getting information out in our control centre at Three Bridges. A team works continuously, other than through the very small hours of the night, to ensure that we make sure that we can get information to stations as timely as possible, in particular where we are putting in arrangements for extra stops. And in the case that you described, the Palmer's Green and Bowes Park, the following train should have stopped if there was a cancellation.
Always stops at Palmer's Green.
Yeah.
It's one of your busiest stations, so that it bypassed it to make up time is bizarre. Yeah.
If that's what the reason was, I'm happy to pick up the details afterwards, but it seems a bit bizarre you wouldn't do that necessarily if the train was running late or whatever. Yeah. So we're not saying we'll get it right every time, but we'll try our best on that.
Thank you, Tom.
It's just going back to this point about whether the timetable should have been delayed, because I've not really heard anything that convinces me that you made the right decision. You had delayed trains, you had not enough drivers, you had a timetable that was agreed at the last minute, and this is the biggest shake-up of rail services in the South East, I think, since privatisation of the railways. In hindsight, was it the wrong decision to press ahead, rather than to take a bit of time and be a bit more careful, and perhaps have a less cavalier attitude towards this?
I think the key word is possibly hindsight, without wanting to replay your question. I don't think we had a devil-may-care attitude at all. The complexity of what we were trying to deliver, all parts of the industry, other TOCs that were involved, the DFT, the ORR, companies adjacent to ourselves, as well as the challenges we had with the existing timetable, as I described in Southern, meant that there were a whole series of steps that we went through very diligently. The fact that circumstances, as John and I have both described, and time were against us has led us to where we're at. But be assured of our commitment. I mean, John and I speak 3 or 4 times a day on trying to get, can we do this, should we do that? And that's just in the very short term, as well as our responsibilities to try and look strategically at how we do the best for this part of the network to the greater good. The issue of, should we have put our foot on the ball, for want of a better description, I think, history will relate at some point when that could or should have been done. But I think the issue, as John described before, was that there are so many interfaces that if we had done that, it could well have caused much greater difficulty for the industry, even beyond the southeast, because of the interconnectedness. When we designed this timetable, and through some of the steps that we were going through in the first quarter of the year, decisions we were making as far as London was concerned were having an impact as far as Sheffield or Manchester, such as the interconnectedness of the rail network. And exactly as John's described, the review that Andrew Haynes is undertaking at the moment as a new Chief Exec of Network Rail, that is to take a view as to what happens next in terms of some of those major changes.
And what about the role of the DFT in all of this? Was there pressure from there to push ahead with the timetable rather than delay it and perhaps review it? Were you getting pressure from the DFT to push ahead?
So the department were on the industry readiness board. They were part of the group of individuals that were trying to create a can-do. Let's make this happen. They were probably 2 of 20 odd people. So from that respect, yeah, they were pushing things along, but along with many of us across the industry. Beyond that, from a Network Rail perspective, I didn't see anything inappropriate. They didn't say thou shalt, or we don't care how you do this, get on with it. There was never any conversations like that ever.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to finish with Rail Magazine, Nigel Harris's piece. He says the industry and government across the board have comprehensively failed us all here, and we need to solve the problem. You regularly have referred to the Industry Readiness Board. 20 odd people, you say, John, sit on it, and that includes, the Department of Transport, includes TOCs, Network Rail, the Office of Rail and Road. Going forward, what are you doing to make that fit for purpose, to make sure the next steps on this programme go smoothly?
We've had one meeting of the Industry Readiness Board since the timetable went live, and it was a very sombre meeting, as you can imagine. We gave a presentation, which I led on behalf of GTR, which was our perspective, quite rightly, as the facing up to the passenger and being the last person standing. I think, as we've said before and as we've alluded to, the industry has a lot to learn out of this, and we take our share of responsibility, as others have done already. But it's back to the small steps that were referred to before. Those need to be very carefully examined, and above all else, just in closing, if I may, Chair, from my perspective, is some of those interdependencies are ones where we need to focus our attention, because the industry systems and structures that have got us to where we're at cannot be right if they have got us to where we're at the moment.
Does there need to be more provision for you to properly analyse and challenge each other's data rather than just taking the word, this has happened, and the reality is it hasn't on time or whatever?
The expectation to find a workaround.
Yeah.
So I think, as I'm sure the committee is aware, there is a review which has been commissioned with Stephen Glaister, and I think that will be that's the crucial output from that review. I think that there is something for both Nick and myself in terms of the personal challenge that we give across the different elements of the railway system, and I think we'd recognise that. I think one of the other points that I think will emerge from what Stephen Glaister does is something around the single control in mind. So the railway is a highly complicated system, and I think I can completely understand the confusion of passengers and indeed committees that are reviewing this current situation. But you will not find a single individual or body which is responsible for this, and I believe that the reason for that is because there isn't a single body or individual who is responsible. So it is both the cause and I think also a key point of learning. So that would be my take on that.
Thank you very much, John and Nick, for your openness this morning with us as a committee. Members, can we note the report and the discussion that we've had this morning? And I think from it we may want to follow up further with certainly Nick at GTR, but I think also there may be correspondence we'll want to send to others, which we can discuss with group leads and delegate to me, I think.
Great.
Is that okay? Thank you, members. Can we agree our work programme for the remainder of the year? Agreed. Our next meeting is Wednesday the 11th of July at 10 o'clock in the Chamber. We have a number of site visits this week, which I'm looking forward to in the sunshine with members. And I have no other urgent business. I'll finish the meeting. Thank you very much.